Nonviolence. Section. Direct action as synonymous with violence. As well as political objectives, debate and criticism also involved the forms of struggle. On the 12th of April, 1963, the white religious ministers of Birmingham asked King to end mass demonstrations against segregation, which they deemed, quote, unwise and untimely. On the opposite side, the police force was praised for keeping order and preventing violence. King responded from prison, quote, in your statement, you assert that our actions, even though peaceful, must be condemned because they precipitate violence. But is this a logical assertion? Isn't this like condemning a robbed man because his possession of money precipitated the evil act of robbery? End quote. The comparison was inapt. The robbed man has not committed any offense. Still less does he call for mass civil disobedience. The white minister's argument is readily intelligible. Violation of existing legal norms, carried out on a large scale and sponsored by any means, hence representing a public challenge and even a provocation to the authorities, was bound to prompt the intervention of the forces of order. It was illegitimate for the organizers of the Birmingham demonstrations to ignore the consequences of the direct action of civil disobedience sponsored by them, and they must therefore be regarded as jointly responsible for the violence attendant on them. However, from King's point of view, the criticism addressed to him made the mistake of requiring superstitious respect for every law, even the most unjust. Quote, there are two types of laws, just and unjust. I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. End quote. Consequently, far from being morally illicit, violation of the multi-pronged legislation that continued to discriminate against, oppress, and humiliate blacks was right and proper. The level of the challenge to existing legislation, and to the duly constituted authority charged with seeing that it was respected, was further increased. In the view of the white religious ministers, this served to confirm that direct action in some way entailed violence. On the other side, in support of his thesis that laws were not always to be respected, King asserted, quote, in our own nation, the Boston Tea Party represented a massive act of civil disobedience. We should never forget that. Everything the anti-communist Hungarian freedom fighters did was illegal. End quote. The U.S. champion of nonviolence thus ended up appealing to two insurrections, the American and the Hungarian, that certainly could not be characterized as peaceful. In fact, in King, the summons to direct action sometimes assumes accents that might be termed revolutionary. Beginning of long quote. Not even the marching of mighty armies can halt us. Let us march on segregated housing until every ghetto of social and economic depression dissolves, and Negroes and whites live side by side in decent, safe, and sanitary housing. Let us march on segregated schools until every vestige of segregated and inferior education becomes a thing of the past, and Negroes and whites study side by side in the socially healing context of the classroom. Let us march on poverty until no American parent has to skip a meal so that their children may eat. Let us march on poverty until no American parent has to skip a meal so that their children may eat. March on poverty until no starved man walks the streets of our cities and towns in search of jobs that do not exist. Let us march on ballot boxes. March on ballot boxes until race baiters disappear from the political arena. Let us march on ballot boxes until the Wallaces of our nation tremble away in silence. End of long quote. What we have here is an at least twofold invocation of violence. In the first instance, it is necessary to silence racists like George Wallace, one of the main champions of the segregationist South, and even force them to withdraw, trembling, from the electoral contest and ultimately political life. Furthermore, as well as unjust laws, direct action targets unjust social relations, for example, segregated housing, and hence involves an invasion of the private sphere. Existing property relations, condemned as inherently discriminatory and violent, are not exempt from direct action. Moderates who reject direct action as violent or potentially violent are refuted in harsh terms, branding them as more dangerous enemies than the racists themselves. Quote, "The white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season, is possibly worse than the Ku Klux Klanner." End quote. The line of demarcation drawn here does not counterpose violence and nonviolence. On the one side of it are professed racists and those who encourage a basically passive wait for reform from above by a dominant class, which, in some unspecified future, will have been miraculously converted, if not to a sense of justice, then at least to benevolence. On the other side, we find arrayed the militants engaged in direct action, which is not always strictly peaceful. Who is summoned to participate in direct action? King was concerned to give the movement the broadest possible base, allowing or encouraging participation in demonstrations by young boys and girls. But, quote, "many deplored our using our children in this fashion," end quote. In fact, as we have seen, in condemning the enforced desegregation of schools, Arendt had some years earlier used the argument that to send black children to schools hitherto reserved for whites meant compelling them to face the hostility of the dominant public opinion and the shouts of derision and intimidation by supporters of the regime of white supremacy. Quote, "Have we now come to the point where it is the children who are being asked to change or improve the world?" End quote from Arendt. Adults were guilty of imposing a harsh sacrifice on their children, and therewith tainted with violence. Unimpressed, in a declaration of the 5th of May 1963, King called upon parents to demonstrate courage. Quote, "Don't worry about your children. They're going to be all right. Don't hold them back if they want to go to jail. For they are doing a job not only for themselves, but for all of America and for all mankind." It was a question of putting into effect the Gandhian principle, fill up the jails, end quote, not even excluding young children. This was an attitude that could only reinforce Arendt's objections. More generally, we encounter the ethical problem already examined in connection with the Indian leader. The problem of a nonviolence liable to induce, more or less directly, violence by the adversary against innocent, defenseless victims, and thus generate the moral indignation required to discredit and isolate the adversary. While he was much more cautious than Gandhi and some demonstrators on the Salt March, who had directly exposed young children to the blows of the forces of repression, King was nevertheless pleased to report the enormous impression made by newspapers that published images, quote, "of children marching up to the bared fangs of police dogs," or pictures of prostrate women and police bending over them with raised clubs. End quote and end of section.